Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you and to admire your stamina for getting through this exciting conference that we've had for the last 3 days. A great welcome to those of you in the auditorium, and an equal welcome to those of you who I can't see but are joining us on the web stream. Wherever you are in the world, we welcome you to this. This plenary session, we've assembled distinguished panelists to draw out overall impressions and conclusions for EFSA to take away for its strategic planning into the future. I'm Tony Hardy. I'm an external expert working with EFSA. I currently chair the scientific committee, and it's been my great pleasure to be part of this conference. We're going to run the next session with a moderator, and it gives me equal pleasure to welcome Barbara Serra, who's an international journalist based in the UK, Al Jazeera presenter, correspondent, author. She describes herself, if you'll pardon me, Italian by birth, Danish by upbringing, and London by heart. Barbara, please.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's a real pleasure for me to be here at this conference and to be moderating the final plenary session. Let me bring you some statistics, first of all. Being a journalist, I do like my stats. In the past 3 days in this conference, 1,235 viewers have actually been following events via the live stream. It's generated 1,300 tweets, and in total, there have been 900 visitors to the conference. So obviously, an enormous success. This is the final plenary session. In it, we will analyze many of the main topics that have arisen. Obviously, we can't touch on all of them, but many of the key ones that have arisen over the past few days. We will be speaking to our panelists, of course. Remember that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll try to subdivide the session in 3 main parts. I'll try to ask the audience at any one point. You'll see people roaming around the room with mics. Just raise your hand. I'll call on you, and you'll be able to participate into this in this session. So let me start, obviously, by introducing everyone here on stage, starting from left of stage. Samuel Godefroy, who's worked as both risk assessor and risk manager in Canada, and also formerly with the World Bank, so I think you'll be wearing perhaps 2 hats in this discussion. Euros Jones, Director for Regulatory Affairs at the European Crop Protection Agency, representing Europe's crop protection producers, whose products, of course, have to be assessed and authorized by Europe's institutions. Angelika Tritscher from the World Health Organization, the coordinating authority on international health within the UN, of course, who will speak about the importance of cooperation at a European and international level and how key that will be and should be in the future. Patrick Howe, head of the Food Safety Department at the Ministry of Health in Luxembourg, aware, of course, of the challenges that actual member states often face in implementing the measures when it comes to protecting citizens' health, and often having to explain those measures to the citizens themselves. Tony Hardy, of course, who you all know, chair of EFSA's scientific committee. Hubert de Loiker, scientific advisor to EFSA's executive director. Then Derek Knight, Senior Scientific Advisor at the European Chemicals Agency. That's one of EFSA's sister agencies, of course, whose work similar to EFSA but dealing with chemicals rather than food. Elke Anklam, Director at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. That's the European Union Scientific and Technical Research Laboratory. Martin Dermine, campaigner at Pesticide Action Network, representing NGOs worldwide to promote alternatives to reduce the negative effects and replace the use of harmful pesticides. And of course, I guess a representative here of NGOs in general and how they would contribute to many of the issues that we'll be dealing with today. And Takis Daskaleros, coordinating officer at the Director General for Health and Food Safety of the European Commission, one, of course, of the key components of Europe's decision-making process. So obviously, as you can see, a lot of talent that we have here on stage, so let's start dealing with some of the issues first of all. So let's start with new approaches to risk assessment. In risk assessment, like in many other fields, the pace of innovation has been extraordinary. And often the question is whether the risk assessment has been able to actually keep pace with the innovation itself. So that question first to Derek Knight. How does your organization, for example, deal with these changes, and how do you think it could be best handled?
Okay, now it's interesting because the conference so far has really reflected how we see things at the European Chemicals Agency anyway, in terms of there is a sort of sea change in the last 5-10 years in the kinds of information that's available for risk assessment, and it falls into two categories really. One is the new approach methods, the omics and so on, that provide huge amounts of information. So the first challenge is how you actually use that information for hazard and risk assessment in a regulatory context. The second element, which fortuitously has arrived at roughly the same time, is much better ways of understanding the biology, the systems biology, the adverse outcome pathway, the mode of action type approach. And because of this better understanding, it's going to be much easier to use the new approach information to work out the risk of chemicals and pesticides and so on. So I've been very encouraged to see this at this conference, because what it means is you need new techniques that are accepted at an international level for combining evidence, data, these new kinds of data, in a biologically rational way. And we're sort of building on the idea of the IATAs, the Integrated Testing and Assessment Strategies, and the work that's being done within the SURAT project, the EU project, with the conceptual framework, which is a way of combining evidence. So I'm very hopeful that these new approaches can be applied in due course to in the regulatory field. And the short-term aim, I think, would be to make use of these new techniques to justify categories and read across, which is an established regulatory process. So the quick win, really, the low-hanging fruit, would be to make use of these new techniques in that way. But I just want to close by saying that I think it's extremely important for these techniques for combining evidence, new kinds of evidence, old kinds of evidence, in a biologically rational way. I think it's really important that those have some sort of international recognition. So I think the role of the WHO and the OECD, etc., are really, really important in this regard to get some sort of systematic and worldwide acceptance of the scientific approaches, and then individual agencies can have their own versions of those approaches if they so need. And the final thought will be, I think it's really, really important to learn from what the other agencies are doing, what other authorities, what other bodies are doing, so that we don't repeat work that somebody else has already done. So I've found this conference extremely useful and encouraging in that particular way.
Derek, thank you. Angelica Tritcher, obviously, Derek brought up the WHO, and there is a real challenge here of making sure that these new techniques, yes, they may be adopted and checked in the EU, but are really accepted internationally. From your experience in dealing with these things, how difficult, how likely is that actually going to be in practice?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Derek already alluded to a lot of the points that are really of critical importance. If you allow me just to also go a step back. What this conference really has shown that the methodological development, including IT tools and methodology, seems to be developing much faster than we little humans can actually follow. So that actually highlights even more the critical need to coordinate and collaborate together and work on this. Like Thomas Hartung said this morning, we have big data now. Now we need to learn how to make big sense out of it. And no institution can do this alone. The challenge that the WHO is facing is actually also a big opportunity. I know those are words that are very much in fashion at the moment, but it is really true. We are not a regulatory authority, which means we can assist the regulatory authorities without the constraints attached with it to help harmonize international methodology. It's critically important that advantage is taken of all these technology and the developments, the tools, the money that is invested at the European and global level to advance regulatory science, that we really put this to practice. And I think this is where the WHO and FAO and the UN organizations can play a role as a neutral platform to facilitate validation and acceptance of methodology so it can feed into the regulatory process. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we could start opening questions to the audience even now. I'm going to probably ask someone else on the panel to see what their reaction is to what we've heard, but please do put up your hand if there's anything you'd like to contribute or a question that you have or anything that you heard in the various sessions over the past few days. First of all, anyone on the panel that would like to add to what we've already heard? Yes.
Yes. Following on what was just said, it was also mentioned several times in this conference that substances are evaluated substance by substance, and that the real life is that everyone is surrounded by many, many food additives, chemicals, pesticides, and so on, and it is very important to increase collaboration between EU agencies and to make use of these innovative tests to be able to better assess the real life of EU citizens.
It is maybe also very important to mention that, yes, we have these new approaches, but we have also to integrate them. We have also to interpret all of these many data. We have to make the right decisions on this. Maybe sometimes can we trust? So these things came in also this morning in our panel session discussion, so that we should not overlook these aspects neither.
We'll be talking about trust in society a little later, but could you just elaborate on that? I mean, what do you mean? What do you think the main stumbling block would be in trust when it comes to this?
I mean, it's important if you get these data that we interpret them in a similar way. That means that the scientists saying, yes, this would have this effect, that this would find agreement at the broad senses. Otherwise, I think we have many groups, many scientific opinions coming out, and then again, who in the end, which model is the best, which methodology is the right. So we have again loads of debates. We have a lot of development in these scientific techniques and instruments we have out there. Now we have loads of data. This morning we even learned that you could now have new IT systems. You feed these systems with the data, then this is sort of a scientific assistant, and then it will come out even with learning, and then the system will say, that's it, this is then the right interpretation. So I think there's loads of requirements for that we really validate this and that we are sure that this is working well.
Okay. Takis Escaneros?
Yeah, thank you. First, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First, many thanks to the colleagues of EFSA for organizing the conference. I think it's a fantastic conference. Thank you very much for the invitation to the panel. Anyways, a very short comment, and I think more or less complementing what the other colleagues said. And looking at it from the regulatory commission side, it is very, very interesting that the conference approached three elements which I think combine into the heart of the matter, and that is really the new methodologies, the data, and expertise. Because at the end of the day, all these methodologies, and I think that's a big challenge to take home, is they're fantastic, very good data is produced on all accounts, like a computer, in vitro, what have you. But at the end of the day, and I'm sorry, but I would speak from the regulatory point of view, they need to be translated into regulatory scientific risk assessments, which basically would want us, at the end of the day, or the risk assessor, to pronounce whether a chemical or an agent or a stressor is safe or not. And I think that's a big challenge for the future, to get these methods for all of us. It's not only for the people who are doing it, but also for the experts and the expertise and the training that we might do, so that we can be able to interpret this information and incorporate it into the risk assessment.
Everyone was nodding vigorously here on the panel as you were speaking. I'm wondering, as we open to questions in the crowd, is there anyone who either has a question or disagrees with that point? No hands? Okay, there'll be chances to ask questions a little later on. So let's move on now to another point, risk assessment and risk management. No longer necessarily a unidirectional or sequential process. Let's start by asking Samuel Godefroy, who actually, correct me if I'm wrong, you've been both. So something which I suppose at a European level is almost unheard of, I would say. So first of all, I guess the question is, does it work? You know, who's right, the Canadians or the Europeans?
Well, thank you, Barbara, and good afternoon, everyone. And I will start actually by congratulating EFSA, first of all, for this great conference, and also congratulate, in fact, the food regulatory community for being convened at this forum, and in fact, for using the World Expo with the theme about feeding the planet, really to showcase food science and food regulatory science, more importantly. So definitely going back to your question, the paradigm of separation of risk assessment and risk management is definitely one of the principles and one of the elements of guidance that we received in the context of international risk analysis processes. And that separation is definitely important, and that separation can happen in different ways. It can happen at the institutional level, so essentially like the European model, where institutions are different in the context of risk assessment and risk management. It can happen as well in the context of, within an institution, separation of teams as well, and that's definitely fundamental. The principle, or this paradigm of separation, is really aimed at ensuring consistency, robustness, the scientific foundation of these analysis and these assessments. But I would say that while that separation is indeed important, so is the intersect between these elements of the triad. And actually referring to the risk analysis paradigm, those circles of risk assessment and risk management are not independent. They are, in fact, intersecting. And that intersect is definitely key. And I would say that the conference, in fact, and a number of sessions that discussed this element brought up this very issue. And having had the opportunity to attend the environmental risk assessment session this morning, the problem of the element of problem formulation by risk managers and the importance of how that is being done was very much discussed, and how, in fact, it conditions the outcome of the risk assessment, how it conditions the methodologies and the processes. And having had, in fact, the opportunity in my former life of a regulator, of being in an organization that did both and managing teams that did both, I've had the experience where some of the risk managers were not necessarily satisfied with the outcome of the assessment. Not that they were not satisfied by the scientific foundation, but essentially that the outcome of the assessment was not as usable as they thought it to be. And in investigating that, it goes a lot into the way the question was framed, the way the problem was formulated. So enhancing the intersect and the dialogue between risk assessors and risk managers, also ensuring that the triad functions in an iterative manner and not in a linear way. So essentially, the outcome of an assessment leading to a management, and then management identifying some other elements that may lead back to an assessment requirement. This is, I would say, a life cycle process and not a linear process.
All right. Elke Anklem, what do you make of that? As a researcher.
As a researcher. Now, what I wanted to bring into this aspect, because I was nodding a lot to your comments, but what is also very important is the independency of the risk assessment and the risk assessor, because this it goes again to trust. And so it is absolutely important that we look into this. And I'm sometimes questioning myself, is there any independency available? I mean, if we do risk assessment, we all have our perception, we all are a consumer, we all bring in some points, and we have this continuous debate whether regulatory science or whether real science or university science or industry science. And I think we have to keep this in mind when we talk about the risk assessment and then going into the management. Yes, it is good that we have the risk governance on the one side and we have the risk assessment on the other side, but we should look very carefully into this whole area of, how much can we trust the data and how good is the advice we give to the risk manager as a scientist. And we should sometimes not be cross as a scientist if our advice is not taken forward. I think there is much advice out there in the world, and it should be the right way.
Angelika Tritscher?
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to that, connecting several of the points, we have to keep the public health goal in mind. What is actually ultimate goal that we want to achieve? Achieving food safety for a specific public health purpose. So we have all these methodologies and tools that are developing, but they have to be fit for purpose, and this is where the integration has to come in with the research science, the applied science in the industrial sector, in the regulatory sector, that we have actually a targeted, a tiered approach how we can actually achieve the goals that we want to have. And this is where the communication between risk assessment and management is so critically important, because the manager has to tell you what they want, what is actually the need. The scientists have to be open and clear about what they can and what they cannot achieve with their assessments, and then it gets into uncertainties that have to be formulated and so forth. But we have to be very careful with integrating it in the right way, asking the right question, or being very clear about what the question is, so that the most appropriate methodology can be applied. And, if I may add one more thought, expertise is another key word now. With our new methodologies, new data mining, mapping, visualization, we need complete different expertise integrated. Risk assessment has always been a multidisciplinary approach, but that is even more important now and even has to expand it more. I think there's a need for additional expertise to be included, and again, even more collaboration necessary. Thank you.
Tony Hardy, I think you had something to say.
I just wanted to reiterate that the interaction between the risk assessor and the risk management manager as an iterative feedback process. We've been talking for 40 years about trying to frame the question. I think we're getting better at framing the question, but I think we've all agreed, and we've seen themes popping up right through this conference which indicate that it's still a challenge in many of the areas, as well as you look across chemical risk assessment, biological risk assessment, and environmental risk assessment.
Okay. I think there's questions from the audience now. There's one over there. I think, Madam, if you could please rise. Thank you. And if you could also say, I don't know whether your question is to anyone in particular or to the whole panel.
No, I think that it can be for the whole panel. I just was thinking about this separation with the model, the Canadian model about risk assessment and risk manager in the same place, in the same institution. And the difference in Europe, I still think that since risk manager is actually something that is to be managed by politicians, by government, the problem is still that Europe is not a real federation yet. So compared to Canada or to USA, I think. So I want to know if how can we go through this big problem? I think it's a really big problem of the community.
Who'd like to take that?
Yeah, if I may, I will try to answer it, although give a bit of an example, and I think that would highlight the probable answer. And I apologize to the colleagues, because I'm going to use a living example from yesterday over lunch. I was talking to two colleagues from a member state, and they said, you know, we do risk assessment and risk management under the same roof. And I perceived them to be almost apologetic for that. And I said to them, frankly, you could be doing it across the same desk, provided the functionalities are separate. I'm using this example to say that what has happened historically, and I don't want to take too much of the time, is a lot of times, and I think that's a human reaction in a way, when we said about separation of risk assessment and risk management, coming back to what Tony was saying about 40 years, really what some people, almost by inertia, it was meant a total separation where there is no communication, and that was not the intent of this all along. The intent was to functionally separate the two, but maintain the communication. And as in many times, you know, the human reactions are more or less of a pendulum. We've gone to the point where actually there was very little communication between the two. So now we're coming back to the point where there is communication. Are we to the point which is ideal? No. I think, as the other speaker said, we need to maintain the communication, even from the conception of the question, maintain it all along the process of the risk assessment, so that at the end of the day, the output is what the risk manager wants. This has to be done, though, in a way that is structured and really maintains the borders of separation, of the functional separation of the two. And I think we can do it both in Europe and in the US, where exactly the same thing is happening under the same roof, but indeed there's a structural and functional separation, and communication is structured in such a way. Okay.
Hubert de Leuken.
Yeah, I think we're on to the dialogue between risk managers and risk assessors, and I think there the issue is risk communication. And I think we'll also have to continue to invest in our risk communication, because the traditional way may be, is it safe or is it not safe? Well, we're building in our communication uncertainties and the degree to which we're sure, but that creates an ill feeling potentially, but that's the way life is. We have degrees of knowledge, and these degrees of knowledge we pronounce on at the time that we make an assessment, and that's based on the information that we have. And then it starts, actually, the day you publish it, it's outdated because things move on. And I think we need to invest very much into improving the sophistication of our communication.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add one more aspect to that, because I think that communication towards the general public is also very important. In my experience, there's a lot of initiative put into communication. It's all transparent, but I think that we don't succeed to get this information into the public opinion building. So the general public is relying on perceptions, and I think that it's not easy for us to bring the scientific assessment into the general public. I don't have a solution for that, but I think it's a real problem.
I suppose the part of the lady's question was the difference also between Canada, which is one state, and the EU, which, as we know, is a group of states. Is that surmountable, or do you not see that as a particular issue?
I think it's more like a general phenomenon. There's the scientific work done, and the general public is maybe, I think, not really aware of it, and maybe it's also difficult for them to understand. So I remember the presentation we had on the British Science Office to explain science to politicians. Maybe such an office should also be there for the general public. I don't know how we could do that, but to explain it to the simple people in the streets.
Well, I can tell you that lots of newspapers or TV stations need their science correspondent, because even the people there don't really understand all the details. So it's definitely a challenge at all levels when it comes to that information coming across. More questions? I think, yeah, it was that lady, yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Bernadette Ossendorp. I'm from RIVM in the Netherlands. From my experience as a risk assessor, I find that the lines between risk assessment and risk management are being drawn in quite different places, depending on whether you work, for instance, for the Codex system or for EFSA. And now this morning I learned that in ECHA, scientific panels take stand on whether a measure is proportional or not, which for my perception would be more risk management than risk assessment. And so my feeling is that there should be a bit more harmonization in that respect. So I would like to ask maybe especially the representatives from EFSA and ECHA, but maybe also WHO, to reflect on that.
Well, Derek Knight, if you want to start.
Yeah. Okay, well, technically ECHA only does, we can issue decisions relevant for particular companies, but we're not competent to issue legally binding decisions where you're balancing up different factors. So for certain substances that require, where there is an uncontrolled risk, they may have to have that risk managed, or there has to be a benefit that overcomes the deficit. And that's what socioeconomic analysis is about. And it's a technical process where you try and monetize the benefit versus the risk, or the registrant, the applicant does that. And then the Commission makes the final decision because it's a policy judgment whether that particular application should be accepted or not.
Hubert, sorry, if you wanted to speak for EFSA.
For EFSA, as you know, Bernadette, we have some variation within EFSA too, where in some panels, such as plant health, we go very far, as requested by the Commission, to give advice on risk management options. If that's the need that the Commission has and EFSA can help with that, then we do that. In fact, it goes even further. When you look at your area of pesticides, once a product is on the market, we get about 10 to 15 million residue records every year, which EFSA evaluates. We do the occurrence assessment and in fact go all the way to evaluating the exposure and make recommendations to possibly indeed take measures because there is exceedances for one or another reason. So I think the spirit still is one of independent advice, and that's the jewel that we should not throw overboard.
Anyone else?
Yeah, thanks. I agree entirely with what was just said. And Bernadette, I don't think one shoe fits all. It's really, the matter is the communication, that it is very clear. It's the independence of the scientific advice, the ultimate decision-making and the responsibility and the accountabilities with the risk management. And so once it is clear, even in the codex system, as you know, the international standard setting process, there are differences depending on the panels. If you deal with pesticides or veterinary drugs or food contaminants, the situation is quite different. But as long as the communication is there and again, the independence of the scientific advice is safeguarded, and the questions are put very clearly. If the risk management advice, what are cost-benefit in calculations for different management methods? What are economic impacts of different maximum limits for contaminants in a certain food commodity? That's a very clear question where the scientific analysis can help the decision-making process by the risk manager. But I'm not sure that it is necessary to have, you know, the same process throughout the different questions. And we have 193 member states, so Europe has it fairly easier compared to that. Although I said we are not a regulatory authority, but we recommend, we advise 193 member states, so that's also a challenge, in particular also from the communication point of view.
I bet. Euros Jones.
Yeah, I think from an industry point of view, I think it's not where you put that line between risk assessment and risk management that's important. It's actually that you have that process in place, that you can go back and forth. And I think we all agree with the point that Tony was making. It's actually the question that you ask. But what we need to develop, what we need to learn from, is the need to actually evolve that question. Because once you've asked the question, and it might be a very good question, once you start getting the answers back, you realize that actually it doesn't completely answer the question that you had, and there's other elements to that question. We need to develop something that allows you to evolve that question, to improve that question, to add to that question, and that we don't have a stop-start system that you have to wait until the risk assessors come up with something and then ask another question, which I think just increases the frustration for everybody, and actually makes communication very difficult as well when you're trying to communicate on a question and an answer that only provides half the answer that you need. Maybe I could just say a couple of words on risk communication as well, because I think this is one of the challenges that we have. Yes, we need to do it better, and I think we need to focus more in terms of putting risk in perspective and doing less maybe communication about the really complex scientific side of things, and doing more in actually identifying what is the real risk and putting it in perspective with other daily risks that we're facing in getting out of bed or getting into a car or eating your breakfast or whatever. We need to do more in terms of putting risk into perspective, and I think who does that? Is it the manager or the assessor? Is an important question. Can I just make one final point? Because Elke made something really one interesting point early on about independence, and I was in the open risk assessment session this morning, which was very, very interesting. And one of the things that I got out of that was that when we talk about independence, what we should be looking at is making sure that it's the idea that is vetted and not the person behind that idea. And I think that's a really important issue. We're spending too much time, too much resources actually challenging the people who came up with the idea, trying to build a conflict of interest. No, we should be actually looking at the idea that's been put forward and vet that idea and decide if that idea is good, irrespective of whose idea it was.
Are there any questions from the audience about this? And sir? Yeah.
Malik Job from industry. Thanks for this debate, and I have just one question. It is concerning the communication. We talk about trust. People need to have trust on what we make on our website or something else. And today, on these topics concerning the risk assessor and risk management, we have a third part. The third part is the public. Public concern, the third part. And at what time the communication will go to the public? If the risk assessor will communicate directly to the public, or the risk management who go to the public with a communication, or both in the same time? Thank you.
Who would like to, Hubert?
I can just quickly make a comment. That is very simply that I don't believe that EFSA would be giving independent advice if it did not have the possibility to immediately publish its opinions. Then I think a major element of independence is gone.
Samuel Godfrey.
Yeah, perhaps to answer directly the question, I would say at every stage that communication should happen. And in fact, it's the guidance that we have received through the risk analysis principles. Risk communication is actually encompassing, and the communication aspect needs to be encompassing. And perhaps actually re-emphasizing a point that was mentioned by my colleagues here around the models and so on. I would say that there isn't a good model or a bad model. We're following the same guidance, and we're following generally similar, if not identical, methodologies or processes. I would say what is fundamental here is really the element of transparency and maintaining that transparency. And in that regard, I would say that the European system and the European institutions is actually exemplary, because we know what the outcome of an assessment is, and we know that that's the outcome of an assessment. And then when a decision is made, we know that essentially that's a risk management decision. So essentially there is an overlay of other considerations beyond the assessment itself. So I think maintaining the transparency of the decision-making process, and that includes, I guess, the involvement of the public, involvement of the stakeholder community, is a key element, and I wanted to emphasize that.
Okay. At the start of at the opening of the conference, the director of EFSA actually spoke of the issue going from truth to trust, highlighting the distrust, mistrust that there often is towards science in the general public. I guess my question is, and perhaps Patrick Howe, I'll start with you, but everyone, what are the main challenges that you're facing when it comes to getting the information across? Is it getting easier now that there's so many specific publications, or you have online, it's easier to access information in more clear visual graphics, or do you still feel that there is an uphill struggle?
Well, I think it's getting even more complicated because outputs of risk assessments tend to be more complex. So I think it's really important that there is somebody you can address and who can explain it to you. And if I look into my daily business, it's very often that we get questions from the public, and because they have seen something pop up on the net, and if you can explain it in simple terms, normally people are satisfied with that. So I think it's really important that besides the communication that is done at the risk assessment level or at international level, at the local level or the national level, there's also communication to the public.
Anyone else would like to add to that?
Yes, for us, transparency is very important to increase trust. We had an interesting talk from the European Medicine Agency explaining how they open the data for clinical trial. And we really see no objective reason for EFSA not to do the same with the toxicological studies and the data that is produced on tests for food additives and so on. And another thing where I do not fully agree with Euros is that of course, the idea is very important, but it's also important to have a good conflict of interest policy, and who is behind it is also for us very important. And EFSA has improved a lot its conflict of interest policy. We encourage EFSA in its work, and for us this is very important to increase trust.
Would you want to reply to that, or?
Yeah. I think the essence of what we're talking about is reproducibility. If one takes it to the extreme, which we will never do, don't worry, but you could actually have the most biased person write an opinion. If it's perfectly reproducible, it shouldn't be a problem. Would we do that? No, of course not. But I think that's what we're indeed emphasizing, and I think that's been mentioned from different sides. You have to be transparent to the extent that it serves the purpose of building trust, and building trust requires reproducibility. Anybody should be able to fully reproduce, and in that sense, of course, you need openness of information to the extent that it allows you to do that.
Okay. Elke Anklem.
This morning we had an interesting discussion in our session, and it's about the open risk assessment, knowledge management, and what comes out of crowdsourcing. We should not forget, yes, scientists do risk assessment and give this advice to risk managers or to governors. There is lots of information also from the public, and in the end, what we are going to do is to serve the citizen with sound risk management. And we learned this morning there are sort of knowledge crystals now popping up on the internet. There's lots of scientific debate on the internet. Many people may have, with this knowledge, with bringing together a big crowd of information, have also an influence of politicians. So it's not only the scientific strength we have to look for, we have to see what's coming out of the new media, information, crowdsourcing, etc.
There was a question from the audience, I think, all the way back there. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. Birgit Nørring, University of Copenhagen. Well, it is a very nice debate, but I think that we have heard through this conference very much about open data, open risk assessment, transparency in risk assessment. We should always give advice, several possibilities to risk managers. But I think from a risk assessment perspective, I think sometimes there's a big lack in the openness and transparency of the risk management process. So my question would be to the regulators, what do you actually do in order to improve the openness in risk management decisions?
Okay, so the regulators would like to go first.
Yeah, I believe that you must look at the risk management decisions in each geographical context, and I speak for the EU obviously, under the certain regulatory context. In the EU, decisions of risk management are really taken at the initiative of the European Commission on the basis of certain regulations, but then the other institutions and the member states take part in that decision making, the Parliament, the Council, and the committees that we have in each of the regulations that make the decision. And on top of that, I think the European Commission is also, at each step of the process, consulting the public, at least releasing plans for that. So I understand that probably one would wish to see everything, but I think, frankly, a lot, if not everything, is already made available via different channels to the public. Could it be more spelled out? Yeah, I guess I would imagine that would be something, but right now we must recognize that in the EU we operate under a certain regulatory context. And that says that the Commission makes a proposal on the basis of the risk assessment, taking into account other legitimate factors, which are basically societal values, and to that stakeholders, the public, member state, the other institutions contribute. But then this is also processed via the Parliament. These are the democratically elected representatives of the European public, and they have a big say into that in most instances. And the member states, whether it is at the Council or the different committees. So there is, at least in the context of democracy as we mean it in the European Union, I think there is sufficient transparency into the process. And on top of that, like I said, I think the Commission has and has in place systems to consult the public on that.
Derek Knightman, also, I'd like to get the mic near that lady because I'd love to get your reaction after you've heard the answers from the panel. So, Derek Knight.
Yeah. Okay, well, in terms of the chemicals legislation, it is actually, the process is pretty open, because you can follow the early stages. So if some substances are potentially going to be risk managed, you can follow the nomination of those on our registry of intentions, if you like. Then you can follow the debate with the scientific committees, our committees, because it's actually quite complicated processes. So there's the Risk Assessment Committee, the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, and you can actually see the technical dossiers as that goes through. And in the committee meetings, there are representatives from industry and state and NGOs. So although some of the debate is confidential, the outcome is public because the minutes are published. But in actual fact, when you think about it, you have a lot of public openness because once the opinion has been issued by the committees, technically, of course, the Commission makes the final decision, but because there's a stylized way of deciding whether the benefit outweighs the risk, for example, that becomes a technical matter. So it'd be pretty unusual for the politicians to override a technical decision, because the technical decision built into the framework for making the technical decision is the policy. So we're turning a handle in a way to operate the policy, pre-agreed policy devised by the Commission. Patrick Howe, do you have a...
Yeah, I think at national level it's pretty much the same situation, because there's dialogue with representatives from different interest groups, and there are the parliamentary commissions discussing text, so I really think it's already transparent.
All right. Angelica?
Maybe I'm bringing a bit a different view in there, because I agree entirely with the comment that was just made in the audience. It's not about dialogue and being able to listen in what's happening. I think there is a lack of transparency in the risk management process because, for example, how these negotiations go often over years. Now I'm speaking from my international experience in codex negotiations, where I have over the years very often criticized the lack of transparency in the risk management process. These negotiations go over years, and then it's very difficult to really capture over the years the development and how then all of a sudden there's a final decision, and it's no longer traceable how the committee arrived at that point, taking the original risk assessment into account. This is where the link to the risk assessment comes, because if there's a lack of transparency in the risk management process, that can lead to a lack of credibility of the risk assessment. You know, there is a lack of validity and the credibility of the risk assessment in the end if it's not clear how the risk management decision come about. It's difficult to tackle, but I think there's a need to spell out more clearly what the decisions were, the final elements that went into the decision-making process. Other legitimate factors was mentioned. It needs to be spelled out. This and this and this consideration was taken into account in addition to the risk assessment. Thank you.
We've got lots of questions from the audience, but I know you want to speak. So very briefly, Martin Dermain and then Hubert de Lucier.
Thank you. For us, there's a lack of transparency in the risk management, and as Takis explained, member states have a big say in the authorization of, for instance, what we work on, pesticides. And in this comitology process, you don't even know what member state voted what. And for us, transparency, but also accountancy is very important to increase trust. And if people, citizens from the EU, don't even know what their representatives voted for a specific chemical that is highly present in the media, this is more difficult for citizens to understand. And in the end, people will blame the Commission, whereas it's maybe only a few member states with who have a big vote who are able to block the system.
Very quickly, 2 points. First of all, I think for new legislation there is an impact assessment. So there is a whole system that the Commission has in place, and I wanted to make that point. Then within legislation, if you compare across EMA, ECHA and EFSA, one might note also that we don't have socioeconomic assessments for, shall I name it, GMOs, for example. Whereas for medicines, there clearly is that type of an assessment. How much will the reimbursement level be for a medicine? And you have already explained, Derek, the same socioeconomic evaluation. Just facts, not positions.
Okay. There's another question, but if I could first get the reaction from you, madam. What did you make of what you heard in the audience? Are you satisfied? Do you still have questions?
Well, thank you. I'm satisfied with the way my question fostered the discussion, so to speak. Thank you.
Well, that's a step in the right direction. Let's take another question. Forgive me, I can't see where the other question was in the audience. Wasn't there another question from the audience? Let me just, while we get organized and find the other question from the audience, I suppose, we're coming to the end. We've got about 10 minutes left. And I suppose the obvious questions is, what are the challenges ahead from everything that you've heard from the conference? What things do you think are close to being resolved? And what did you feel even more at this conference are still the same questions you were asking yourselves years ago? I don't know if anyone would like to start. Samuel Godefroy.
Sure. At least I can attempt. I think actually just taking some of the elements that were made here, there was a common thread that was made. We're living really a far more complex world right now. Like science is evolving, food products are evolving. The food regulatory community and definitely the food risk assessment community is being faced with an ever more complex environment. And I guess actually this is being exacerbated with innovation, technology, big data, and so on. And this, I think, emphasizes ever more the importance of the expertise that is needed to be able to face these requirements and actually still maintain that public health goal that Angelica mentioned, which is essentially the protection of the health and safety of consumers, whether it be at the national, European, or at the international level. And I think with that element of expertise, I think comes the element of the requirement to invest in training. I was actually pleased to see during the conference that there were a number of talks that were actually speaking about training, capacity building. I was also impressed by the fact that the word food regulatory science was actually mentioned in a number of instances, because that discipline is not necessarily recognized everywhere as a particular discipline. And I would say that if the needs for training are important in countries such as the European countries or OECD countries, I would actually make the case that for the developing world, this type of expertise is even more needed. And actually here, building maybe on a point that was made by the executive director of EFSA at the opening ceremony, mentioning that food safety being a pillar for food security. In order to achieve food safety globally, we need to ensure that we invest in food safety knowledge, and part of the investment in food safety knowledge is probably training on risk analysis, on risk assessment, and particularly a contribution to doing that and investing in that in the developing world. So I wanted to mention that because having had a little run through the World Bank and having identified the need at the global level, I think this is an area where the global community should be addressing in some fashion.
Angelica, I guess it leads me to you when it comes to international training. How far are we, do you think, from achieving that kind of training?
That's a tough question. I cannot quantify that. No, I fully agree, of course, what Samuel said. There is a very important need, but we don't even have to look that far. I would even go a step better. There is a very crucial need to foster better the understanding, even in Europe, big schools, universities with important, for example, toxicology. That's where I come from. That's why I know that area. That's why I can mention it. Important university institutes have been closed over the last decade or so. So we're losing also expertise within Europe. But it's even more important to bring other countries than the Western world on board. We have countries that are the biggest world food exporters. Food is a global commodity, and we have to work in that fashion. So yes, there is an urgent need for training and capacity building. And now I'm making the loop to what I said in the beginning. That even illustrates more, again, coordination, cooperation in this, because we have a common goal. Samuel also mentioned another word that I jotted down, innovation. Where should we go from here? As you asked to go back to that question. I think EFSA, since we are asked to advise on the future, what are the priorities next step, it's to embrace innovation in a targeted fashion. So to embrace the innovation, all the new methodologies, the new technologies, to improve the risk assessment the way it is needed You know, we have in the chemicals area, we were talking about how many chemicals are out there that haven't even been looked at. What methodologies do we have? We cannot afford to go on this one chemical testing in one scenario. That's just nonsense nowadays. I think I see on the front, in the future, or already there, and in the near future, tools and methodologies that help us answer more complex questions in a much more speedy fashion. We go from high throughput screening for prioritization to the next level where we can actually make first much more educated guesses where to go further, where is the concern, and so forth. So this is, I think, the first immediate step to integrate in the risk assessment processes new technologies and how we can do this together, where academic, industry research, and regulatory science can work together.
I know we have a question from the audience. If you do have questions, bear in mind we are running out of time, sort of 5 more minutes or so, so do feel, make yourself known.
Hugh Jones, Rothamsted Research, and a member of an EFSA panel. It's a question for Takis, really, but I'd be interested in all your views. It's now possible to make the same genetic changes to animals and plant cells using a range of different tools. Is it ever justified to regulate hazards and risks of the final product depending on the way that the change was made, the tool was used? Thank you.
Okay. So, would you like to repeat the question, please?
I apologize. It's now possible to make the same genetic change in an animal or a plant cell using several different methods. Is it ever justified to assess the hazards and the risks of those changes using the tool that was used as the trigger rather than the change that was made, the hazard and the risk in the final organism? Thank you.
Yeah, the only answer I can offer, because you're speaking obviously for a specific example, is basically in order to take measures on anything, we rely heavily on the risk assessments and the experts and their expert judgment and the evidence they have to evaluate. And on the basis of that, we decide how to propose risk management measures. Thank you.
I take it there's no more questions from the floor. Anyone else that would just like to do a final, we are coming to the end of the debate, and apart from Hubert, who will give our closing remarks, Euros Jones, if you'd like to. Very briefly, if you don't mind.
I just wanted to say a couple of things about, picking up on what Angelica said about learning about high throughput testing and actually having a better understanding before we go and evaluate each substance in detail. I think there's one issue that we often don't mention, and it needs to be mentioned, and it's the issue of animal testing. We all have a responsibility to actually look at the high throughput, to actually really focus on the key issues that we need to be testing and minimizing the animal testing, and that links into the issue of global cooperation as well. This is a key issue that we too often forget about, and we really need to get back to it and minimize animal testing.
And certainly an issue that the public, for one, is incredibly passionate about. Gentlemen and ladies of the panel, thank you so much. Thank you in the audience as well. Now for the concluding statement on this panel, Hubert de Leuker, Scientific Advisor to EFSA's Executive Director.
Thanks, Barbara. Maybe 3 points. The first point I would like to make is about an issue that we haven't addressed so far, is the success of the poster session. This morning I was with colleagues from Kenya. We had a very good time. They were so proud to be participant. They said, how are you going to help with the training? Perhaps a follow-up is that if we have a next conference, that we have, like many others, a module for training, and why not use all your expertise to help each other? That would be one point. The second objective, of course, of this conference was to push the boundaries. It has helped us enormously to prepare this conference, to get to know all these colleagues that are working in areas that we certainly want to collaborate with, explore. We'll make some mistakes as we explore these new techniques, as long as we keep in mind what's the purpose, what's the added value of a new technique. It's not for the new technique per se. Thirdly, I think that many of the key challenges have to do with a change of mind. We love, for example, pure science, but you know, in reality, we need regulatory science. Maybe this work that has been presented on BPA allows us to combine in a very nice way the pure science, the applied science, to underpin the needs that we have. We can issue 50 opinions, but if we don't have any information, we better keep our mouth shut. So, Elke, we need you. And a second challenge is about the openness. The openness, well, we can tell you that technically we're able to do it, but we still face probably some hurdles, both in the private, but I'm afraid also in the public sector, about reticence to share data. So we need a change of mind. It's not just only regulation, I think it's sharing of data is a state of mind. Thank you.
Hubert, thank you very much, and thank you to all the members of our panel for today's discussion. If I could ask you, please, to take your seats in the front row. Thank you. Thank you.